6 September 1939, Berlin. Hitler and the German High Command are elated. In 6 days, their blitzkrieg tactics have sealed the fate of Poland and all but destroyed its armies. They are now free to begin moving divisions out of Poland and back to their dangerously undefended border with France. The Germans had gambled that the Western Allies would be slow to mobilize and indecisive about retaliating for the invasion of Poland. Their gamble seems to be paying off. The French, who, if they acted, would have a virtually unopposed march into Germany's industrial heartland, have inexplicably reacted only by asking the British Air Force to refrain from bombing German positions. So the French army sits in its $500 million defensive position known as the Maginot Line, nervously staring across the border as the German forces increase. The Germans, who made blitzkrieg a household word as they streaked across Poland, have coined a new phrase for the French strategy: Sitzkrieg. The uneasy peace that results is surely temporary. While there is little visible activity at the front, in Berlin there are major changes in the long-standing plan for the invasion of France. The original called for the German armies to pour through Belgium as they had in 1914. But General Fritz von Manstein puts forth a daring new plan. It calls for a diversionary attack in Belgium to be followed by the main German thrust through the heavily wooded Ardennes, south of the French-Belgian border. Von Manstein believes that Allied armies rushing north to meet the initial threat can be cut off by the main German force and annihilated. On 10 May 1940, the plan goes into effect. Army Group B, under the command of General von Bach, plunges into Belgium and Holland. Allied troops flood north to meet the thrust, their leaders failing to recognize the fact that the Luftwaffe, which had been so successful in cutting off reinforcements in Poland, makes little attempt to impede the progress of British and French armor units. Meanwhile, General Kurt von Rundstedt's Army Group A, consisting almost entirely of armor and mechanized infantry units, sweeps into the Ardennes. By the 12th, Army Group A has reached the Meuse on a broad front from Dinant in the north to Sedan in the south. Believing the Germans will need 5 or 6 days to concentrate their forces for a river crossing, the French fail to recognize the grave threat to their flank. On the 13th, 1,000 Luftwaffe planes strike the French Second Army opposite Sedan. The diving Stukas strike terror in the French defenders, who abandon their artillery positions for their trenches. With the cessation of French fire, General Heinz Guderian's mechanized infantry forces easily ford the Meuse and establish a bridgehead. On the 20th, a mere 10 days from the start of the campaign, Guderian's forces reached the English Channel at Abbeville. The German plan has worked brilliantly. The Allied armies in the north are now surrounded on 3 sides with their backs to the sea at the French port of Dunkirk. With Guderian driving up the coast from the south and Army Group B pushing from the north and east, the destruction of the British Expeditionary Force and the French and Belgian units with them seems to be but a matter of days. The English people, hearing of their army's plight, mobilize in a last-ditch effort to save their men on the coast of France. On 1 June, a desperate flotilla, made up of every available ship from the largest liner to the smallest fishing boat, begins the treacherous trip across the Channel. With the RAF providing what cover they can, the ships come in as close as possible under heavy German fire. For 3 days, the boats cross and recross the Channel until 3 June, when all British and some French and Belgian soldiers have been rescued. On 5 June, with northern France in their control, the Germans begin the second phase of their offensive. By 10 June, German forces advancing along the coast cross the River Seine west of Paris at Rouen. On the same day, the already beleaguered French are dealt another blow. Benito Mussolini, unable to resist sharing in the spoils of a defeated France, sends 400,000 Italian troops across the border into the French Riviera. By the 11th, German troops reached the Marne River west of Paris. With German armies driving south on both sides of Paris, the capital is declared an open city. The Germans, however, do not move to occupy it until the 14th. The main focus of their efforts is the destruction of what remains of the Allied armies in France. On the 14th, the Maginot Line is penetrated south of Saarbrücken by the German First Army. Now the German advances are limited only by how far the panzers can move in a day. The battle for France is, for all intents and purposes, over, and what little will to fight the French have shown fades. On 17 June, French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud resigns. He is replaced by Marshal Henri Pétain, a French hero from World War I. Pétain is convinced that France and Britain are doomed to defeat, and that dealing with the Germans will be, in the long run, better for the French than continuing this futile resistance. He announces he will ask the Germans for armistice terms. Meanwhile, the German advance continues. Guderian's forces successfully drive all the way to the Swiss border. On the 18th, the 7th Panzer Division under General Erwin Rommel captures Cherbourg as the 5th Panzer takes Brest. On 22 June, the French delegation, led by General Hunziker, goes to Compiègne Forest to sign the armistice. Hitler, not about to miss the satisfaction of dictating terms to the French, personally heads the German delegation. Fulfilling his own vision of historical retribution, Hitler holds the surrender ceremony in the same railroad car the French had used to dictate the terms of peace to the Germans at the end of World War I. General Wilhelm Keitel presents the German terms, and after hours of discussion, the French agree to them. 2 days later, Hitler travels to Paris to fulfill his lifelong dream of entering the French capital as victorious conqueror. He is jubilant. He has defied the world and prevailed. His armies have smashed every obstacle in their path, and most importantly, the great injustice of Versailles has been reversed.